Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming to the Socratic Club debate tonight. This is the second Socratic Club debate of this year, first of winter term, so thank you all for showing up. Very excited. As you may know, this is the Socratic Club's 13th year at OSU. We have a long run, it's very cool. To the returning audience members, thank you for coming out on a continued basis. It's very nice to have returning fans, and for you new folks out there, thanks for joining us tonight. The OSU Socratic Club, so a quick summary of how the club goes. We organize religious debates and dialogues between scholars for the benefit of OSU and the surrounding community. And the club was first founded in 1941 at Oxford University with C.S. Lewis as its first president, so we have a long kind of history of the concept here. The mission of the Socratic Club is to provide, quote, an open forum for the discussion of the intellectual difficulties connected with religion, but with Christianity in particular. More information on the club and some free essays are available in the lobby, the table you guys walked by. Please feel free to stop by the table and talk to any of us after tonight's debate. There'll be Socratics out there to talk to you. Our website is another great source of information, and also includes a link to our YouTube channel, which features videos of many of our previous debates. The web address for our website is listed on the brochures, which are also available in the lobby. So the goal of tonight's debate is to shed light on the topic of how to live hopefully in the face of the reality of evil. Our two distinguished speakers will each address this issue, presenting divergent views. The structure of tonight's debate is as follows. So first, each speaker will be given 20 minutes to speak in defense of his chosen position up here. And next, there will be 20 minutes of discussion between the two speakers, during which they can ask each other questions. Questions from the audience will then be taken for about 45 minutes. Those 45 minutes tend to pass really quickly, and there's a line, a little bit of competition to ask your questions. So make sure you form your questions carefully, maybe write them down. I think there's space on the brochures to do that, and then come up and get in line when I tell you to. And we'll try to close by 9 o'clock after each speaker gives a 3 to 5 minute closing remarks. Am I good? Yeah. Okay. So I'd now like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Michael Patton. He went to Vanderbilt as a microbiology major and decided to add philosophy and do a double major his second to last term. He's now a professor of philosophy at the University of Montevallo in Alabama, where he has taught since 1996. He's also taught at Felician College in New Jersey, University of Hawaii at Hilo, and the University of Tulsa. Currently, Dr. Patton is working on an original monograph on the philosopher David Hume, and it's entitled Hume and the End of Design. He has recently published in the areas of ethics and metaphysics, and enjoys infusing his scholarly articles with humor. As he puts it, I take teaching more seriously than anything, but I can't do it without passion or humor. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Michael Patton.
I'm going to go ahead and do this because since I had my knee surgery, this is the soundtrack of my life. No matter where I put it, it falls down. So just get that over. So I'd like to thank Peter and all the other members of the Socratic Club for having me here tonight, and both of us here tonight, and for taking me out to lunch. And I'd like to thank Dr. Frengren for helping the club and therefore the event here tonight take place. And I'd like to thank Dr. Breshears for being the other half of the debate. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I like the topic of this debate in part because it's different than the oft-trod ground of the problem of evil. It's about how to deal with the fact of evil, as at least the title puts it. That puts me in a different place than I usually am when I'm teaching my students about this debate historically. So I'm going to probably take an idiosyncratic approach to this. And if we get too off topic, I'm not concerned. I think we'll certainly be on common ground about what we're all talking about before the night's over. And by the way, I have recent experience with the problem of suffering, as I often refer to it, instead of the problem of evil, because I sat right next to the mother of all crying babies, flying from Houston to here, and she had her baby with her. So, sorry. It was a bad flight. So to discuss what the sources for hope might be in the face of evil, I guess I want to discuss whether we should believe in God, and then talk about how, if at all, God would give us hope. So first of all, I think the question that matters isn't as much do I believe, but should I? Tonight, I suppose part of that answer is determined by whether believing would give us hope in the face of suffering or evil, more so than other options we have if we don't believe. I always try to understand where a belief comes from when I assess it for plausibility. I see where loyalty to football teams come from. It's usually an accident of birthplace. It's especially acute in Alabama. I don't really think one football team is intrinsically better than another, no matter what their current record is, but you like the team you grew up rooting for. Also with tastes in food, music, and art, the belief that some food or other is good is deeply dependent on where you grew up and what the local customs were. This is true for art and music as well. So I don't think the crawfish are good or bad, or that Bollywood films are superior to or inferior to Hollywood films. It's a matter of what you're used to. But we're here to talk about whether God is real and a source of hope. So maybe there's some differences. God's supposed to be a being that exists or not a food or an artwork that we have different opinions about. So that's one difference. But there's an issue that the two discussions do have in common. The specific things you believe about God do seem to depend on where you were born. If you'd been born in Islamabad, you'd most likely be Muslim. Elsewhere, you would have been Hindu, Buddhist, Zoroastrian, Taoist, or whatever. But since most of you were born in the US, it's pretty likely that many of you, at least, are Christians. We could delve into the issue of whether these religions are all talking about the same God, but when we go from Judaism to Buddhism to Taoism to Shintoism, that seems pretty unlikely, and it's also a giant topic for another time. So back to the topic. How should I decide whether I should believe in God? Okay, so I want to talk about the origins, as many thinkers better than I have talked about them, of religious belief, and start by noting that sometimes the origin of a belief undercuts your likelihood to believe it. Before anyone believed in UFOs, there were people that reported hearing airships going by. They conceived of these as sailboats, giant sailing vessels in the air. They talked about hearing crews shout orders to move the sails about, and hearing the creaking of the rigging. And then when Sputnik went up, those reports went away, and they got replaced with UFO stories. Right? Actually, it was way before Sputnik, but when the space age started, when we started shooting things into the orbit of the Earth, suddenly people started talking about little green men and flying saucers. And now, with drones everywhere in the sky, flying saucer reports are going through the roof worldwide, I'm told, where there are drones. So it seems to me in that case, the history of the belief in airships or UFOs or little green men kind of makes you think I shouldn't believe that. This seems like somehow that people are projecting some common human fears on unknown technology, changing times, and things like that. So what are the origins of people's beliefs in God? I don't know. But there are some famous works out there that discuss it, for good or for ill, and I'd like to just talk about a couple of them. Two really different thinkers, Sigmund Freud and David Hume, both wrote very similar books on the origins of religion. They both tell the story, which is, let's be straight, a just-so story. No one was here taking notes when this all happened, but if this has plausibility to it, it's interesting, I think, to our discussion. They tell stories where at first human beings didn't understand much about the world, and terrifying things happen. Lions come in and eat you. I guess that's not really all that common, but they could. Floods happen, earthquakes happen, droughts, lightning strikes. And the claim is, first by Hume, that the only thing we understand about how things happen is we make them happen. We see that. My agency makes me pick up the bottle of water and take a sip. I had to work that in because I was thirsty. And so when we see something happen in nature, the only way we can even begin to understand what's happening out there is by the model of how we do things. It's like when we project motives onto other people, we projected them in our early history, our prehistory, onto nature. So if lightning strikes, something must have hurled the thunderbolt from Mount Olympus or wherever. If the drought happens, something must have made it be droughty this year rather than a good crop season like it was last year. And then as this proliferates, this idea that we can understand in some analogical way what's happening in nature, Hume and Freud both say, boy, that got a lot louder. Is that better? Okay. I sound like I've got a deeper voice than I think I do. Hume and Freud both say that this was comforting, that we could first understand why these things happened, even if it was a mythological understanding, and we could also attempt to control them. We tell stories about Zeus and what he likes. Besides appearing in various forms and attacking female women, he seemed to like courtesy. And the theory was if you were just courteous to strangers, then you would bring about Zeus's punishment. So courtesy was made into a virtue. We could decide that we had somehow offended Demeter, and that's why the crops failed. We could try to appease her, and so on. So it gives you both the illusion of understanding, as we would say now, the illusion of control, and that made people less unhappy, made people less afraid. I presume, in the spirit of tonight's lecture, it gave them some hope. If things are bad, there's a way to keep them from being as bad as they are now. We can try to figure out what we did wrong and fix it. And then Hume and Freud both talk about the march of what we call science. That is, we find out that there are natural causes for lightning. We found that out fairly late in the game, actually. Ben Franklin was still flying kites in lightning, trying to figure it out. And we find out that there are meteorological causes to floods and geological causes to earthquakes. And so there's nothing left for the gods of the polytheistic religions to do. There's less and less and less with each foot set forward by science. And what remains is this code of how we should act to keep the gods happy, things that get turned into virtues, like being courteous, being kind to strangers, taking care of propriety when you're in certain situations in public and in private. And they get a little fuzzy here, as people who tell just so stories do. Eventually, all that's left for the one God, as these religions turn into monotheisms, to do is to set the moral order and to explain the origins of the universe. Naturalistic science, when it tells its own story, figured out everything else. It didn't, but it says it did, or it says it's going to, right? So God is left just as the creator and the arbiter of morality, and then perhaps judge still at the end of it all, but very often not so much intervening judge like the gods of the Greeks and so on. So it looks like believing in God plays a very important explanatory role for some of our most deep questions. Science answers some of the trivial ones. Why is my car running badly? Well, blah, blah, blah. I don't know anything about cars. I still change my own oil, but I don't even do brake jobs anymore because I'm afraid I'm going to mess up the anti-lock brakes. So it's terrible. So modern neuroscience seems to be confirming this. There are all sorts of papers coming out now that there's an internal unease in people about their origins and their ultimate fate that people who have religious beliefs suffer less from. They do brain scans on people. When they're thinking about these things, they're in a religious fashion, they're more comforted than if they're not. And so it looks like we might have a naturalistic story to tell about how these beliefs arose and what purpose they serve. And then the question is this one of those stories like the stories about UFOs and airships, one that makes it more likely that the stories are true? Because of course they could be. No one can solve that question. If we could prove one way or the other, we wouldn't be here. Or does it make it more likely that it's not true? Does it make it more likely that you should believe it or shouldn't? Now, part of what I'm talking about here goes against what I said I was going to say. That perhaps not believing in God would make us able to console people in the face of evil better than believing in God. I just told you neuroscientists tell us that it looks like religious belief is something we naturally seek and that does make us psychologically more calm. All right, enough of that. There are personal reasons to believe in God. I mean, I would be immensely comforted if I knew or even believed strongly that I was going to see my brother, my mother, and my father again when I die. That would be great news. Not believing that exacts a cost, right? All the things I didn't do, didn't say, should have said, and so on. Also fear, right? Plato wrote about this. What happens when we die? Plato says you don't know, so you shouldn't worry about it. But that's one of the most curious passages in all of philosophy. If I don't know what's about to happen, I worry about it a lot. It's when I do know what's going to happen. I am very good at imagining catastrophes. I look up at that big projector there and I think, when's the last time they checked for rust on those bolts? I got it from my dad. I see a glass half empty. I see half a glass of water and think, oh my God, that could be the last water on earth. Or that glass could break and cut me and I could bleed out right here. It's a bad thing. But so, if you have a religion that tells you things about what happens when you die, and it also gives you a scheme for trying to be on the right side of that judgment, that would be very comforting to a lot of people. All right? if it could be bad, it's better to believe something that might make it better. And it could also give us hope during hard times. God's existence could assure us that all the suffering and evil means something in the end, and that either it'll get better, make us stronger, or someday be explained in the great by and by. All right, those are sort of more, I say less argumentative reasons for believing in God. There are plenty of arguments for God's existence. One is one's the design argument that's ancient, and then we have Hume's counter-arguments, and then Darwin's proposed solution to the problem of apparent design. Besides that exchange, there are a few other historically important arguments for the existence of God, and then the whole literature of criticizing those arguments. In the end, it looks like a stalemate resolved only perhaps by faith or adherence to naturalism. The faithful say the arguments work even though they're deficient. The naturalists say they don't work because they're deficient. But Pascal famously offered a different approach that I want to talk about tonight, and I've wasted a lot of my time, but that's okay. He says, rationally speaking, if you want to bet, you got two choices. Believe in God or don't, and then there are two possibilities. God exists or he doesn't. If you believe in God and he exists, you win the lottery, right? You got to have it if you've lived the way you're supposed to. And all you've lost, Pascal says, is 70 years of being a hedonistic nightmare, where you just indulge every whim. Usually religions come with some advice not to do that. If you believe in God and you're wrong, all you've lost is that 70 years, and then you get the same thing everyone else gets when they die, which is nothing if there's no God. But if you don't believe in God, and there's a God, we have a problem, right? You're facing perhaps eternal punishment instead of eternal reward, and all you got for your troubles, which are going to be manifest very soon if that's the way God works, is 70 years of kind of sybaritic fun. And if you don't believe in God and there's no God, well, then everybody gets nothing. So Pascal says the obvious thing to do is to believe in God. Now, there are lots and lots of problems with this argument, and they're well known. My favorite, though, came from The Simpsons, where Homer didn't want to go to church. And he said, well, don't you think the Almighty has better things to worry about than whether one little guy spends this measly hour, where this one little guy spends one measly hour of the week? And what if we're picking the wrong religion? Every week we're just making God madder and madder. And that is a problem. Pascal assumes God is a certain way with certain mechanisms for punishment and reward, and he doesn't know that. But anyway, what my worries center upon tonight, and I can't believe I'm just not getting into it when I'm about to get the 5-minute sign, are what the psychological effects of believing are. And I'm not a psychologist, and I don't know. But it worries me that perhaps the psychological effect of believing in God would be to diminish our likelihood of reducing suffering in this world. I sometimes think that too much public faith in the efficacy of recycling makes us produce as much, if not more, waste than we would if we focused more on the problems of energy use and environmental degradation. Let me be perfectly clear. I'm really pro-recycling in this world. I led a campaign, or was co-leader of a campaign that got recycling in our tiny little Alabama town. But now people think, it's going to be recycled. Well, there's a long story about what happens to recycling. It's really downcycling, and it's not clear that we wouldn't be a lot better off buying, it is clear, we should buy reusable plastic bottles, not this. But recycling gives us an out. After all, why shouldn't we generate more trash if we can all be recycled in some way that's just assumed to be good for us all? I'd be willing to bet a person who understood our impact on the environment, but was a recycling skeptic, would do less harm to the environment than her friends who believe wholeheartedly that recycling fixes the problem of waste. Painting with a broad brush here, running out of time, my own fault, I know. And as for having hope in the face of suffering, it could be that excess hope that things will be okay would only be fostered by belief in God. After all, the scope and depth of human suffering is vast, and our powers are quite puny. If we believe that all the suffering is justifiable by God's standards, then whatever suffering we fail to alleviate will still get taken care of in the end. When people say the Lord moves in mysterious ways, that seems to be what they're saying to me, although I'm no expert on what people mean. I'm told I get it wrong all the time. When Shakespeare suggests that Gertrude should be left to heaven, I presume this is what he had in mind. Every time we take solace that things we can't make better or prevent will in the end someday be made right by God, we are perhaps to some degree not doing all we could to eliminate suffering here on earth. So perhaps the agnostic or atheist who cares about suffering would do more to address problems than her believing counterparts. Tons of assumptions there. There are people that don't do anything about suffering no matter what they believe. I'm not trying to say this would be a necessary consequence. I'm just trying to say that I worry that belief in God might take away people's motivation to alleviate suffering and to provide hope in a way that it wouldn't do it for an atheist or an agnostic. Whether those people would do anything about their obligation to relieve suffering is anybody's guess. To sum up, I've made what I rather childishly called Laxap's wager. It's Pascal spelled backwards. So, if you believe in an evil excusing God, and by that I just mean the God that would somehow justify all the bad stuff that happens, either by fixing it eventually or making it good for you or what have you, and there is one, then it's almost psychologically conceivable that you won't do all you can to ease suffering during the one chance you had. In fact, even if you cause suffering, it's okay by this choice because God will take care of it in the end. But if you believe that this God is out there, this evil excusing God, then you might not be as motivated to alleviate suffering. If you believe in an evil excusing God and there isn't one, it's just as psychologically likely that you won't do all you can to ease suffering during the one chance you have. But here, at least if you caused some suffering, that would be bad because the world would be the only realm that there was for you to do anything in. If you don't believe in God and there is an evil excusing God, then he'll surely let you into heaven for all that you've done to ease suffering during the one chance you had, assuming you eased suffering. But if you don't believe in God and there is no evil excusing God, then you'll have done all you can to ease suffering during the one life you had, and that's better than nothing. So I'd say in the inverse mirror image version of Pascal, the best thing to do is not to believe. If what you're looking for is motivating people to do what they can to help people live in the face of the undeniable bad suffering and evil that does occur in the world. So morally speaking, I would say, and this is overblown, said for the sake of starting a discussion that will get into the much more delicate issues here. Morally speaking, I'd say you might be better off not believing in an evil excusing God. So if the original origin of religious belief was in fact to lessen human anxiety and suffering in the face of unexplained evil, like Freud and Hume and others think it is, then I propose the way to achieve this end is not to believe in God, and so to be motivated to do as much as you can to stop suffering while you're here. After all, if you don't believe in God, if you're right and not believing in God, then you're the last chance we've got. I'll end, because my time is nigh, just quoting from Penn Jillette, because magicians seem to be the smartest people on earth to me. It's a weird thing, but he wrote this for an NPR essay. He said, for himself, believing in no God means the suffering I've seen in my family, and indeed all the suffering in the world, isn't caused by or by an omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent force that isn't bothered to help or is just testing us. Rather, it means someday we may be able to help others. In the future, perhaps, we will be able to bring about the possibility of less suffering. Thanks very much. Talk to you in a little bit.
Thanks very much, Dr. Patton. I'm going to introduce our second speaker tonight. Also give his beginning remarks. His name is Dr. Gerry Breshears, and he is a professor of systematic theology at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon. He has spent the past 3 decades teaching at Western Seminary and has also spent time teaching at various Bible colleges and seminaries in places such as Lebanon, Ukraine, the Netherlands, Taiwan, and Poland. He's been published in numerous magazines and scholarly journals, including the Journal of Psychology and Theology and the Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society. Dr. Breshears has said that his passion is bringing theology to life. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Gerry Breshears.
Well, thank you, Dr. Patton. That was, I had never heard it. How do you pronounce Pascal backwards? That was...
Laxap.
Laxap.
While the baby was screaming in my ear.
I love babies, but not screaming in my ear. Yeah, that would worse coming down and just learn Laxap. I've got to work on that one. What I'd like to do here in the time I've got is make a case, actually almost in complete agreement with Dr. Patton. Because I think if you believe in an evil excusing God, you're believing in a demon. And I completely reject the idea of an evil excusing God. I don't think that's the biblical narrative in any sense. In fact, what I would argue, what I'll try to present here, is a very different picture of a God at war with evil, whose commitment is to build good and beauty and what we call justice or righteousness. And that God is anything but evil excusing, in fact, exactly the opposite to that. Let me unpack that thesis just a bit here. In that context, say why I believe that there is reason for hope in the midst of a world where evil is the undeniable reality. Just a bit of history. A century ago, there was the great liberalism, classic philosophical and theological liberalism, that said we call it modernity now. In little by little, in every way, every day, things are getting better and better. And people bought into that, and then World War I happened. And the absolute center of civilization at that point was Germany, close behind French, England. But Germany was the center of liberalism. University of Berlin was the center of the liberal scheme. The theater in Berlin, unmatched. And that's not to downplay what happened in England and France at all, and then what happened in 1914, when the Archduke of Sarajevo went to war, and Wilhelm Kaiser sent his troops to attack the French, because volatility was high. And instead of attacking directly the French, because of course that means you run into the French defense forces, he sent his soldiers through the lowlands, through Holland and Belgium, where I have taught. No war involvement at all. And when he sent the soldiers through there, they didn't just go through. They raped and pillaged. Now that was bad enough. But the thing that made evil the undeniable reality was that the leading liberal philosophers and theologians put together a letter signed by the top 91 or 93 intellectuals of the day, saying that was not only okay, but necessary. Evil is the undeniable reality in our society. And the thing that makes us most evil is when good people excuse evil. And the evil of those people now has been diced and sliced by philosophers and theologians, and I would stand solidly with them. When I read the biblical narrative, when I stand here as an evangelical Christian, I had my turn into practical atheism as a high school and college student. So it's not that I'm unaware of that view from a personal perspective. And Dr. Patton and I have already had some very fun conversation here. We discovered we like each other, even though we disagree on some of the things. Yeah, I don't have to be a likable guy. This guy gets along with me. It's good. But the biblical narrative begins, and in Genesis 1 through 11, whether you take that more literally or more metaphorically, the meaning is the same. God created a good and beautiful world. Not a perfect world, but a good world, because this initial world was unfilled and uncultivated. So he created humankind in his image as covenant partners to work with him in filling and cultivating and keeping and working this primordial place that is called the Garden of Eden. Here is a God who is committed to goodness, beauty, order, justice, and he is building it, and he creates humans to work with him in this project. He blesses them and says, let's work together. And in this beautiful place, there was a counter-narrative that came in. As the story is told, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, God's narrative for that tree is to his covenant partners. He said to them, dangerous tree, don't eat it, it will kill you. So here's the tree. Dangerous tree, don't eat it, it will kill you. To his covenant partners, who he has created in his own image and good and in their project together. The counterforce, evil, the serpent, comes in, same tree, different narrative. That's a good tree, eat it, it will make you wise. And the question between these two narratives is whom will you trust? And of course, as the narrative goes, Eve and Adam decide to trust the serpent, and they eat of the tree. And the question is, whom will you trust and whom will you align yourself with? And in that spot, of course, the evil broke out, as the story goes. The question is, what is the response of God? In the context of evil breaking out against his will and not by his doing, seems to me. In fact, he gave the command to the opposite direction and the place to do good and call people to do good and help people to do good. When he comes, his call is to Adam, where are you? Inviting him to confession. And when Adam says, I heard you in the garden, I was afraid because I was naked and I hid myself. Confession. God's response to him is, who told you that you're naked? And see, the whole point of it here is, what narrative do you believe and what are the consequences of that narrative? And in the context of that evil, instead of excusing the evil or saying, I have a greater plan for that evil, God does exactly the opposite. He makes a promise that there will become the seed of the woman, whom we know as Messiah, later to find out as Jesus, is the one who will come, and the promise is he will crush the head of the serpent, and he will do it in a way that the serpent will strike his heel and kill him. And here is this is Genesis 3:15, if you know the story. And what happens at this spot is, in this narrative, is that God is saying, I am at war with evil. I am so much at war that Messiah, and we don't know much about him yet, will give his life to conquer the evil. He has called people into that covenant partnership with himself, continues to do it. The narrative goes ahead through Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who, especially Abraham, called into covenant partnership so that these people can work with the evil destroying God, the justice building God, and his call is for us to do that together. What happens so often is that these covenant partners, again, believe the wrong narrative. Instead of covenanting with God to build justice and beauty and community and righteousness, they join with the narrative of the serpent in that the highest pleasure is my comfort. And when they do that, they bring evil back into the world. Instead of the ordered society of righteousness, they bring the self-servingness of the individual, and evil and injustice break out again. God does not give up on it. Skipping past a whole lot of stuff, we come to the story of Messiah, Jesus. Here is, as the Orthodox Christian story tells it, and I believe this to be true, an historical fact that a baby was born whose name was given Yeshua. Yahweh is salvation. And that salvation is to destroy the evil and build the good. And this one, we believe, is the very God himself, who has existed in absolute comfort in eternity, who leaves that place of comfort, leaves behind his prerogatives and privileges, and comes not as a king in Rome, not as a prime entertainer in the Greek theater, not as Beyoncé with endless pleasure at her fingertips, or put in whoever you want there, but comes as a baby delivered into a place of rejection. Even the family will not let them stay in their house because of the degradation that they see him in. This is the way God comes into the world, not to excuse evil, but to live deeply in it. His very first experience is having to be an exile in Egypt because the local political guy decides to kill him. When that political guy dies, they move back to Nazareth, and he lives in grinding poverty, a poverty deeper than any of us are ever going to know. In this country, you cannot live at that level of poverty in the United States. You have too many things available to you here. He lives under cruelest of political oppressions. If you look at the Nativity story, Mike Rich's great film that came out here 5 or 6 years ago that makes Secretariat, Radio, Finding Forrester. He made the nativity story, and he shows what that political oppression looked like. This is how Jesus lived. This is the God who gives up all of his comfort to come into the place of suffering and evil. And of course, you know, he comes into Jerusalem, and he's attacked by the religious leaders, eventually arrested by Herod, or by the high priest, Caiaphas, and told by Caiaphas' servants, this is the religious guy, get him. And in my judgment, not even Mel Gibson could portray what those soldiers did to Jesus in the back room. I have friends who are soldiers. You've seen it at Abu Ghraib and places like that, the degrading thing that soldiers do to enemies when they're told to get him. And that's what Caiaphas' soldiers were told. And then Pilate's soldiers were told the same thing. How much did Jesus suffer even before he went to the cross? And who is this? This is the God of the universe who said, I will go to the depths of evil. This is not the evil excusing God. This is the God who brings evil into himself in order to destroy it. And he's crucified, but that's not the end of it. He is raised to newness of life, pours out the Holy Spirit, and he calls people like you and like me to join with the evil destroying God, to say, let's set ourselves against evil. But here's the kick. Instead of overcoming evil with evil, you strike my cheek, I strike your cheek, and maybe twice. No. The ethic of Jesus is quite different. The ethic of Jesus in Romans chapter 12, and by his own words, is to overcome evil with good. It's not to punish your enemy for being your enemy. It's to love your enemy and make him your friend. It's to destroy evil, not by using the weapons of evil, but by using the weapons of the Holy Spirit of love, who is willing to give up comfort for the sake of pursuing justice. This is the God who gives up privilege for the sake of creating just community. And he's called us into that. So the sort of stuff he's talking from Freud and Hume, I totally agree. If that's the reason for coming to belief in God, so that I can have less anxiety and more comfort, that's totally contrary to the Christian story. The Christian story is you go from the place of comfort to the place of suffering, and you go deep into those sufferings to bring justice, not just relief of anxiety. See, my goal, when I and many others go to the place of poverty and the place of injustice and the place of extreme, is not to give a handout. You know, they hold the old thing that if you give a person a fish, they'll eat for a day. Teach them how to fish, they'll eat forever. But see, the problem is many times the rich guy controls the lake, and the poor guy can't get to the lake to fish. You've got to do the justice work and open up the place so the poor man can not only learn how to fish, but and have access to the pond, to the lake, so he can fish. So you're doing structures of justice. We are not evil excusing as Christians, exactly opposite. We hate evil, because God does. And we join with him in that process, not of overcoming evil only, though that's a really important theme. The triumph theme of atonement at cost of my own comfort in life is a reality. But it's more than that. It's building a genuine community where people have reason for giving up privilege, giving up money, giving up prerogatives for the sake of the justice and the relationship of the whole community. Now, how has the church done in that pursuit? In all too many cases, abominably. Why is that? Because we continue to come back and hear the narrative of the serpent that says, do it yourself. Do it for yourself. Do it for your own comfort. Do it for... It's just isn't... There's all kinds of justifications for making my own comfort, my own privilege, etc. And that is fundamentally anti-Christian. So in my own journey, when a reason for me. Why do I believe in God? Part of it's because I believe in Jesus. And though I was raised in a Christian home, I rejected Christianity to the core of my being. But what I couldn't do, and I'm looking for what hypothesis gives explanation for the realities of the life, I looked at the evil and said, is there any hope of overcoming it? And when I looked at the naturalism that I was tied into in Ayn Rand's objectivism, I could see absolutely no hope of overcoming evil except by being John Galt, being the Nietzschean Superman, who by virtue of my own arrogance and power attraction is able to make my own way in the world. Fundamentally anti-Christian narrative, but in one sense it makes sense. I looked around being very much in the arts, literature, and music, and I said, where is the source of beauty? Where's the explanation for the reality of beauty? I had a friend, Phil Wright, who was very much a deconstructionist, which was a new thing in those days, deconstructionist art. He was an incredibly talented artist. And he was doing deconstructive art. And he was explaining me to philosophy of that. And I found myself thinking, even in your deconstructionism, you have to believe there's a beauty to begin with before you can deconstruct it. Where is the source of beauty? Where is the source of this concept of it's wrong for a dad to rape his little girl? Why is that wrong? We all agree that it is wrong, but why is it wrong? And those kinds of questions, the beauty was a big one for me. The thing that I knew things were wrong, why human rights? Why do we believe in human rights? It's a fundamentally Christian thing. But why do we believe it? And of course, much of the world doesn't. So I looked at these and I said, which one accounts for it? And I found that a Christian hypothesis explained a lot more. I'm also into science. I did an undergrad work in math and astrophysics, would have continued in that. I look at the very questions of origins. Where did the universe come from in the Big Bang world? Where did the first life come from? Where did consciousness come from? Another area is, where did the very concept of God come from? Now, those are negative questions. The positive question, the one that was just gripping for me, was, how about the resurrection? I'm going to look at a guy who's dead, a guy who had followers who were totally in despair. In a little town like Jerusalem, they claimed to have seen him alive, and their life was changed by that. Take those facts that everybody agrees to, what's the explanation for that change? And that led me to look at the resurrection very seriously. So there's positive reasons for my faith as well, but here's the bottom line. Where's the hope in the face of evil? And for me, the hope in the face of evil is a God who is not evil, oh my gosh, exactly the opposite. A God who is committed to creating beauty, overcoming evil, and doing it at cost to himself. That's a compelling story. And that's a story I've given my life to. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Breshears. That was excellent. And we're now going to move to a discussion. You guys are already seated. As I said, there's kind of two more stages to the debate. We're going to first have dialogue between the speakers, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So for the discussion section, the speakers will alternate asking questions of each other. I'll allow for free-form discussion in general, but I'll also be standing up here to try and guide the topics and keep things on track. So speakers, please limit your answers to 1 or 2 minutes, maybe 2 minutes, just in the interest of time. And that's per person. Also, I'd like to remind the audience to remain respectful of our speakers by not applauding until the end of the discussion. You guys have been very good so far. And that'll be the same for the question and answer section, and we'll applaud at the end. And we'll begin with Dr. Patton. If you have a question for Dr. Breshears, let's get you mic'd up first, though.
Sure. There's not a thing in your account of what real community is like that I would deny. And a lot of our points of departure from each other, I think, come from, as a naturalist-leaning person, I deny the sort of existence of ontologically real evil that's different somehow than just human suffering. But that doesn't seem especially fruitful as a discussion. So I guess I wanted to say that I think that there is an available explanation for the existence, say, of the feeling of right and wrongness in people. And I think it was hinted at by Hume and then written actually quite a lot about by Darwin, and then most recently a fellow named James Rachels at University of Alabama at Birmingham published a book called Created from Animals, where he says that if we accept all the other things we accept about evolutionary theory, about why we have the bone structure we do and so on, we should also accept that our faculties to be empathetic and sympathetic are evolving and inherited from creatures that at one point didn't have them and then had them. And everybody that has a pet knows that, until you get down to the level of fish, pets have empathy and sympathy for one another and for you. My cat, the only good part about being ill is my cat comes and gets in bed with me. Probably because I'm just warmer, because I have a fever. I'm not really deluded about that. I know the cat is just waiting to eat me. And I just, in terms of thinking about that and why groups, communities of the type that we both certainly support work, I think there are answers also in thinking about ecology. Ecological systems that persevere are ones where, especially when you get to bigger mammals, where there is a group concern, where there is a common good, where the family unit existing makes that species the one that's going to survive over the species that doesn't have strong kin selection, as I think the biologists call it. So I just wanted to see what you thought about that. I don't mean to be turned away. About the, picking between these. I'm afraid all night we're going to be picking between, as we were talking about earlier, neither of us can prove one way or the other. So you've broken one way on the question, I've broken on the other way. I mean, I just tried to ask a question that might get something else going.
Let me just make one comment. I do think that Jesus is historically provable, much in any historical figure. So the proof of God to me goes through Jesus very strongly. I don't prove a theistic God. I don't come at it as a philosopher, but we'll probably come back to that. The question of the rise of the knowledge of righteousness is a very interesting question. I'm very intrigued with the naturalist explanation for why community, and to a certain extent, tribalism has a reason behind it, because of my tribe, one person doesn't do as well as 8 people together if they can cooperate with each other. So yeah, there's some sort of evolutionary reason perhaps for tribalism, but what happens is when you look at righteousness, you're looking for more than tribes getting along, because tribes just form wars. And what we're saying is, as a Christian anyway, is that there's a higher righteousness, and when we look at examples of that working, we all say, that's good. And it's not because the tribe is stronger, it's because there's something inherently in that. The other thing is the rise of self-sacrificial comfort, diminishing righteousness seems to make no evolutionary sense at all. Why should I give up my privileges and give up my stuff for the sake of something larger than myself, other than maybe an immediate family system? So I still think there's something that can't be explained in something that absolutely exists, and we all have that sense that's right when somebody sacrifices themselves for something that they get no personal investment out of. So I do think there's more there. The Christian narrative, of course, explains that pretty easy, because that's the very nature of God. So again, which is the best hypothesis to explain. That's the way I come at it anyway. What do you think?
And there's the problem of altruism.
Altruism is a huge issue.
Was a big issue in evolutionary theory. And I guess it was Peter Medawar in the 50s when he was also trying to explain sexual reproduction, which was an issue. You're diluting the amount of genes that get through to the next generation by not just cloning yourself like single-cell animal organisms do. But the altruism and the kin selection that was worked on from the 50s onward just exploits the fact that once you get to creatures that don't get born immediately able to fend for themselves, if they're born to parents, or whatever, I hate to anthropomorphize, but if they're born of creatures that don't care for their needs, then that whole arm of the evolutionary tree stops at generation 1. If you had birds that didn't bring food back to the nest, that sad little couple of birds that laid 3 eggs and flew off will be the last of those types of bird. And then there's, really statistical technical work, and then there's just really sort of anecdotal descriptions of that work that I'll give you, that show that certainly you're better off caring for your family, but you're better off caring for the cousins, and then the second cousins, and the third cousins, in that the whole group does better. And then the claim is, right, that this sort of tendency towards care for others at your own expense, because me going and getting food and giving it to my kid takes a lot of my time and effort, is worth it for the, is wired into your ways of thinking, patterns in your mind. So that's the road down which I would go.
Yeah, and see, the thing of it is what happens, that ends up in some sort of genetic engineering type stuff. And what we end up doing is we sacrifice the weak for the sake of the strong. If we really believe in evolutionary advancement of the race, then what we should do is we should take Down syndrome children and execute them. Now, that's actually being done in our society, and I would argue it's because our society is less Christian and more pagan. And the idea that I should sacrifice my comfort as a parent for the sake of a Down syndrome child. Now we have genetic engineering, genetic testing, and I can find out my baby is Down syndrome before it's born, so I abort it. And we just had the case up in Seattle of a family that had a 50-50 chance of a seriously defective child. They had genetic testing, the doctors told them it was okay, they had the baby trying to be seriously deformed, and they just won a $50 million lawsuit against the hospital. And if you take the natural thing, that is absolutely rational way it should be done. We should kill defective, or at least exile, but probably kill, because they use up unnecessary resources, and put that into the elite, so we advance the race as a whole. And I absolutely reject that view. And I think many people do, at least in a theoretical way, and many people do in an actual way. When it's my baby, I want to give up my rights for the sake of that Down syndrome children. And not just because it makes me happy. See, that's the difference in morality in the two.
Well, I know that there are people who use the techniques that our understanding of how genetics works for those sorts of purposes, and I think it's appalling. I think it makes...
Why is it appalling?
Because
that's exactly the question. Why is it appalling to kill a defective child?
Because it extinguishes virtuous behavior like natural sympathy and empathy.
Oh my gosh, you sound like a Christian.
No. I think that with Hume, these virtues exist in, or these tendencies to be empathetic and sympathetic exist throughout the natural order. It's more highly developed in us, and it has conduced to us becoming a civilization, or whatever you want to call it, that has unlocked the genetic code and can now use it for terrible purposes, I believe.
Yeah. But why is that terrible?
Why
slow down the whole thing? Why slow down the march of the tribe? Leave the old lady behind.
No, because the tribe is the unit of good in some sense. And if we got everyone thinking in the purely selfish manner that most people conceive of evolutionary theory as saying we all should behave or do behave, then you wipe out all the species. If we don't act from the, if we don't go with the altruism that got us here at the end of the dance, we're going to be off the face of the earth pretty soon, according to evolutionary theory.
Yeah, there's a tribalism, to be sure, but if I can appeal to Star Trek movies, does the good of the one outweigh the good of the many?
No, the good of the many outweigh the...
So he came and sacrificed himself for the sake of the ship, but then we resurrected him, so we had to get God back into the picture. I hope God isn't like Spock. I hope he's a better actor. He's just so wooden.
Dr. Breshears, would you like to ask a question?
I've been kind of doing that, yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
You have the opportunity to change the topic.
Yeah, okay. Let me just, I've never heard, I'm much intrigued with what you're saying. I've never heard anybody argue for an evil excusing God in the way you did before. I've actually heard some people in some varieties of Christianity with a very hard Reformed view, in effect make that by saying all evil really is good if we could see it from God's perspective, but that seems so contra Scripture. Why would you have the sacrifice of Jesus Christ if everything is really good? It makes no sense. But evil excusing God, where did you get that idea? Because I don't know that. I mean, that's not a normal Christian position anyway. And I'm not enough of a philosopher to know if it's really a theistic philosophy.
Well, I put it this way: the song "From a Distance"
it's
charted
that song
4 times.
I hate
it's been
that
number
song.
1 twice by 4
I
different
hate
people.
that song.
I do too. I think it's
Good. You
And
sound
so-
like a Christian all the time.
But so, when you say that's not mainstream Christianity, I see very clearly it's not what you live as a Christian person.
Right.
But it is what I hear all around me, in Alabama at least, as, oh, things will be all right in the end. It's for the better good. He's in a better place now when someone dies. And these are just ordinary people that in some cases that I know of personally are being told that they're selfish for mourning the loss of a loved one because the loved one is now okay and better off in time. And that's like,
Have
okay,
they
so
read the
everything.
Bible?
Probably not. They certainly didn't get out of it what you got out of it. We'll get back on the deconstruction about this, about what message you take. So, I made up the term on the airplane, but...
I like that. I'm going to be much intrigued by that, because I do know some people that probably are an evil excusing God.
I think rather a lot of them are in the mega churches that dot the landscape in my region of the country. Because that message is that you'll be enriched in the more populist TV show style of those churches. It's that you'll be able to put away your cane and walk again, or in the really most dispiriting ones where Reverend Ike says, if you send me $20, you'll get $10,000 back in the mail.
I have a picture of Reverend Ike's future, and it's probably not what he thinks it is.
He sits on a golden throne and says all this. I think he might be dead by now.
There's actually some words in the Bible about him.
Yes. Would they were true?
I believe they are.
Right, so we're not going to bridge that ontological gap, I don't think.
But when you say somebody is saying that my loved one is or your loved one is in a better place now, they're not saying death is good. They're saying that there's hope after death. That's different than evil excusing.
But right, doesn't every sparrow fall with his knowledge and all of that stuff?
No, that's an interesting place for a Bible translate. Many people cite that every sparrow falls by the will of God, and that's not what it says. It's saying that God cares about the sparrow that falls. It's not that he wills the fall of the sparrow. Is that his care extends to the sparrow that nobody cares about except God himself. That's actually a statement of the care of God, not the some sort of predestined will of God.
I didn't know that. I mean, see, I
know, because it's so often misquoted.
Right. And not being in the faith campus side, things like that, I've not read the Bible.
We can arrange for that too.
But it's philosopher's disease, right? There's the God of the philosophers, and the church fathers created this thing that gets out of hand and turns out not to be like the God of the churchgoers, and that gets crammed into theology in a lot of places. It gets very high up in the Catholic Church, where he has these properties that raise these problems that are the ones that I usually get. I usually talk about with other philosophers who are Christians. God's all-knowing, all-powerful, and morally perfect, so why does anything bad ever happen? And then, you start off saying, this is not the story. The story is that evil pre-exists, it's ontologically real, and God's fighting it, but he, in fact, lacks the capacity to banish it completely.
Yeah.
And that makes much more sense.
That philosophy, of course, that comes from Hume. If God is good, he must be impotent. If he's omnipotent, he must be malevolent. If he's both omnipotent and omnibenevolent, whence then is evil? Well, see, what's happening is that particular fallacy, or that particular argument fails. As you're a philosopher, you know this, because you're presenting this as a complete description of the system, and it's not. That fails because you have to have at least one other proposition in the thing, and the other one is there are wills other than God's. And as soon as you put a will other than God's in there, the whole system falls apart. But what happens is people understand that Hume's syllogism is not a complete description of the system. And they take it as if it is, and too many Christians ignorantly do that. And that if those three are true, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, evil exists, then you're right, the whole thing falls apart. But if you put in one more thesis in there, that there are wills other than God, now we have a reason for evil and why God is opposed to it, and why doesn't God just end it immediately, is he'd have to kill people, and he wants to redeem them.
Well, the one that actually gets inserted after Hume is that God knows everything. And this gets you all these problems with freedom of the will.
Yeah,
because if God knows the complete future, then he does know what we're doing, and that's very challenging to overcome.
Not necessarily.
In terms of there being free will. Well, I think
That's a thesis I'll not grant.
If
God knows the outcome, therefore the outcome is determined. I know a lot of philosophers say that. But when people ask me, how does God know the future? My answer is biblically, I don't know. There's a lot of things about God I don't know, and I actually have to admit ignorance. If I say God's knowledge of future depends on determination, then I've said I know how God knows things, and I don't think I can know that.
Well, I would say it doesn't matter if we know. I would say we can understand that a system's future states were determined by some forces we know not what, if we notice again and again and again the same thing keeps happening. If I had a magic mirror that let me see which horses won which races, I wouldn't necessarily have to believe, well, the mirror is making those horses run faster.
Right.
I just know, hey, this thing works. And then I would have to think, so the future isn't really open. The magic mirror tells me how it's going to be. So it couldn't have happened that that horse broke a leg because I saw it win the race and it won the race. So we might not have to, because we better not have to.
Let me come back on that one.
Sure.
Because the simple fact that a mirror would show me the future doesn't tell me how it got there.
Right.
That may be there because the jockey made a choice for a particular weight of saddle that made that horse run a little bit faster. That jockey could have made a choice for a little less than that. In that mirror, looking with a different choice, would have seen a different win to the race. All that is descriptive knowledge.
Not if it's prior to the jockey's choice of saddle.
But you just made a magic mirror that gets past the predictive, because I'm actually descriptive. I'm actually looking at the actual result, not making a prediction of how the result comes into being.
Right, but the magic mirror lets me predict infallibly.
No, the magic mirror is going into the future somehow. It's been Bill and Ted Nelson's most excellent time machine, apparently.
Well, it could be just like how I know where the cue ball is going to end up when I hit it with my pool cue, because I wasted my youth in bars. And now I'm wasting my adulthood in bars, but I'm no longer good enough at pool.
I never was very good at pool. Yeah, but at that point you're talking about something that is determined, at least to the level of quantum physics, and cue balls are quite a bit bigger than neutrons, right. So we can determine those. What we can't determine is a genuine choice of humans, and Scripture teaches clearly, I think, that humans genuinely have choice that is non-determined. It's a personal choice that I make, and in a real sense that it is non-determined and can't be predicted because there's a choice involved in it. I really think that's the case.
Yeah, I've never believed in human free will. I know that's
really
odd to say without a lot of context.
Oh, I mean, a lot of people don't. Then where does responsibility come from?
If
it's determined, you can't have responsibility. We're going to go that direction, we can go there too.
Yes.
How can you have responsibility if I'm determined by prior constraints? There can't be any personal responsibility. There can be a systemic responsibility.
I know. I mean, I understand the hill I'm charging up.
Yeah. Really?
And it's a very long answer to give.
Yeah.
It goes back to much more naturalistic, deterministic systems in nature that lead us to be empathetic creatures. And I mean, the whole problem of talking about free will is, if you try to deny it, then you have to say things that sound like you're contradicting yourself.
Yes.
But it can be explicitly stated without contradiction. It can be a consistent view, but it does rob us of lots of things we like to think about in some sense.
Jeez, 1 minute. Let me ask one more. Sure. Where does the belief in free will come from? If it's not real, where does the belief come from that I believe that I really am making a choice that's a real choice?
It comes from the fact that you can't predict something as complicated as the interplay of the desires you've got in terms of what they're going to lead you to do. So think about it's so hard to come up with quick examples.
30 seconds, yeah.
Yeah.
I'll give you 2 more minutes. Go for it.
Consider a very closely balanced equal arm scale. You set it in motion, and it does this for a while, and slowly comes, and maybe it's going to balance, or maybe it's going to be like this, or maybe it's going to be like that, right? There's a fact of the matter of how it's going to come out. It depends on which pan has more weight in it, or whether they both have the same amount of weight, or mass, sorry. That, to my mind, is a very crude model of what happens when you're trying to decide between the chicken and the steak at a restaurant, when either one would be really good. But you're going, I don't think you're sitting there adjusting your desires for this reason. If you could adjust your desires, man, You could make homework more fun than video games. You could make, if you could just turn desires on and off. It seems to me that the experience of having desires is that they pop up in my head. Usually I know not where from. Sometimes they're simple, like steak or chicken. Sometimes they're very complicated, like getting out of bed in the morning. I love sleeping, and I love hitting the snooze bar. And at first I think there's nothing more I want to do than sleep. And then after a few more snoozes, I really set my alarm half an hour ahead. I realized, hey, wait a minute, if I don't go to work, I'll get in trouble, and if I get in enough trouble, I'll get fired. If I get fired, I'll lose the house to the bank. If I lose the house to the bank, I'll never sleep comfortably enough again to hit the snooze bar. So what looked like a no-brainer, work, sleep, woohoo, turns out to be, because of the connectedness of the get up desire to all these other desires, in the end, a no-brainer the other way. It just took a long time for that scale to settle out. That's the long, quick version.
So you're saying there really isn't a choice to get out of bed?
Right. If there were, I'd still be in bed.
Okay, your time is up. Thank you, all of our speakers.
Dr. Patton, thank you. And I had a question about the evolutionary basis of empathy and sympathy, because I think that's a very fascinating topic. And I think what's my question relates to the personal side of that, because when I look at myself, I see that I'm basically a selfish person. And I feel like at my best moments, I'm sympathetic or empathetic or care about someone else, but my natural tendency is to be selfish. So how does that sense relate to the idea of an evolutionary basis for sympathy and empathy?
Well, there's a definite requirement that you be selfish to some degree so that you live long enough to be able to express the sort of needed empathy and sympathy to be of use to the larger unit. I think that creatures that never had to exist as members of communities, the unicellular creatures or jellyfish or even fish for that matter that don't need to take care of their young, are merely selfish things. I mean, fish eat their own young that they can't get out of the way. So that's one reproductive strategy. You have so many offspring that it doesn't matter what happens to them, a few will live. Once you get complicated animals, mostly in the birds and the mammals, then you can't have that many offspring because of the energy requirements, and you better take care of them or that's the end of everything. So there's a big component of selfishness, I think, in terms of behavior, as you're describing it evolutionarily, that precedes the development of empathy and sympathy. And then I think what happens is there's no doubt that human beings get influenced by culture to a degree that's unprecedented in the rest of nature. And we live in a society right now that teaches that Hobbes was just right about human nature, that we're essentially selfish. And that reinforces capitalism, which the whole capitalism doesn't make any sense unless we're all selfish and wanting to get the most we can. And because of the miraculous ability of capitalism to generate excess growth, we don't see the needs of others very often if we don't go looking for them. So I think the sympathies are there in people, except for natural variations, to a pretty high degree, but we've done a remarkable job of not running into people that need help and being told that that's okay through our culture and the way we've situated ourselves. So I would suspect that we're all more sympathetic than daily life gives us a chance to see, and it's an amazing thing to find someone like Gerry Breshears here that goes and confronts the really deep, needful poverty that's out there and does something about it, because we've got a system where we don't have to do it. I mean, I don't know if that really is a great answer, but...
One of the things that I just find remarkable, we're coming about the 10-year anniversary of the Indonesian tsunami. I know people in that area, no, not in the immediate area where the tsunami happened. The thing that just absolutely amazes me is I look at who's actually involved there in doing the relief work. It's almost exclusively Christians, and it's almost exclusively done among Muslims. There is a cross-tribalism help that's absolutely remarkable. I frankly wouldn't believe it unless I knew people were involved in that kind of stuff. And that, to me, that's a point of a Christian narrative that makes things dramatic. Another place I run into that, we've just seen the death of Nelson Mandela, who began as what would be hard to say other than an absolute terrorist in an awful situation, done in the name of God, for crying out loud. And Nelson Mandela had a genuine, deep Christian conversion there in Robben Island prison, and came out as a deeply Christian man, and he called in F.W. de Klerk, the head of apartheid, into his government, made his enemy his friend, and we all celebrated the success of a Christian vision of cross-tribal empathy and cooperation that worked out because of the leadership skills of a man named Nelson Mandela living from a Christian vision. That is almost unique. Pope Francis, people are just falling all over themselves to say how much we appreciate, again, a genuinely Christian vision. Now, the fact they do it is because they're Christians. Why is it that non-Christians admire what's happening? Because that's cross-tribal empathy. I think the reason for that is we're designed as the image of God and have that built into the core of who we are. And the selfishness is actually an evil imposed by a broken system that Christianity fights against.
Next question, please.
My question is on the origin of religion. It's for both the speakers. Basically, this guy, Stefan Molyneux, has this theory that we evolved from. The general idea is that we evolved from monkeys, right? Monkeys have the alpha monkey, but the alpha monkey gets old, frail, can't continue the dominance in the later years. So the idea is that religion was, or deferred pain was how humans evolved to for the alpha male to stay in dominance as his physical strength kind of wanes off. So I was wondering about both your opinions on if that makes sense, or what your opinion is on origin of religion.
Well, a question like that would be, why would the adolescent monkey buy into such a silly notion? Just kill the old guy.
Yeah, it's a difficult thing to decide. I mean, obviously, right, that someone that's a faithful Christian is going to believe that the origin of religion is revelation or contact with God or his works, right? So, I mean, that's the right answer for you. In terms of what to say about this particular theory, as I understand it, it gets more difficult to decide when things are culturally transmitted versus genetically transmitted. And I don't know what to say about the possibility of cross-species cultural transmission, and I'm afraid it might be too short a time frame for a behavior pattern to get encoded in the genes between our first closest ancestor in evolutionary history. I mean, people sometimes elide over the difference between inheriting cultural norms that become very important in how we treat each other and actually having evolved types of behavior. And I don't know what the time frames are. I'd be interested to see the more complete description of that. But it sounds like what Hume and Freud were writing, but going back even before human beings and saying our closest ancestors had single male leadership that looks like monotheism, and that could be one of the forces that got us into monotheistic religions, which pretty much came to dominate the religious sphere, by the time history gets going pretty well. I don't know. I need to know more about it, but I'd like to find out.
Dr. Breshears, did you have any other comments?
The origin of religion, to my judgment, is an absolute conundrum unless there's something out there to have that come from. I've listened to a lot of different evolutionary explanations for the origin of belief in God and the persistence of belief in God, and I can't for the life of me see any reason for it to survive. I find these explanations literally incredible. I think if I were on the evolutionary side, I'd say that's bizarre. It's kind of an irrational belief that ought to be eradicated or something. But where did it come from? That's part of the reason that I'm inclined toward that there's actually something out there that's the origin of that belief system. Why it persists. And the irony is, even in atheists, there's still belief in a God. And that's the God I don't believe in, and there's usually some reason behind it. Dawkins was, I think it was Dawkins' name was Hitchens in Lebanon, in Beirut, and he was down in South Beirut where the Hezbollah crowd is, and he started doing some of his stuff, And these guys take offense to that kind of stuff, and they came with a nickel and getting beaten up badly. And he says, well, thank God we got out of that. And then everybody started laughing. Why does he thank God? He's a famous atheist. Because that belief in God seems to be ineradicable, I think is wired into us by God. I don't see any other reason why religious belief would come.
Can I have one quick?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Help me understand that.
it seems to me that we are, as a organism, creatures that look for causes and explanations. But anytime you hear a noise in the middle of the night, your first thought is, what caused that? No one thinks, oh, one of those noises, they just happen. Unless you have cats. You know that the cat has destroyed something of value. So we want
That's a cause.
we want explanations, we want to seek for the cause. And there are very sharp natural limits, or limits to naturalistic explanation. It's the act of embedding one isolated phenomenon in a broader context. And the context can't keep going on forever. So just for a quick example, suppose we get back to the Big Bang, inevitably someone says, what caused that? Now, that question may be the limit of explanation from a logical point of view. There may be no explanation for what caused the Big Bang. But that doesn't stop anyone from thinking, no, but really, what caused that? You can't exhibit or think of a phenomenon without thinking of its cause. And if you can't find the cause in the natural world because you're up against the theoretical limit of explaining, a common move is to move to the supernatural and say something outside the explanatory order caused that. But as you just said, the cat's an explanation, so is God did it. And now someone asks, and Hume talks about this at length, what is the explanation for God's existence? And there, everyone gets to say, there is no cause. God has always existed. And Hume comes back and says, well, if that's good for God, then it would be good enough for the natural order. Why not say the natural order always existed?
Because science says the universe had a beginning. That's not just a hypothesis. The Big Bang, so-called, is verified as quantum physics.
Oh, well, it's not...
So
we don't yet know whether there's a cyclical, endless cycle of Big Bangs yet.
But that one's been rolled out. The current idea is the multiverse.
No, that's just...
I agree with you.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
Gerry, this question is for you. I heard you briefly mention God's foreknowledge and God's kind of preordaining or predestination. There's a verse in Acts, and I forget exactly where it is, and I hope you know it, but it talks about Jesus being preordained to go to the cross. Now, was this something that God would just know what would happen because of our sin? Or something that God had planned before the foundation of the earth?
You're talking about Acts 4:27-28, where he was said, Herod and Pilate and the Gentiles and the Jews, the Romans and the Jews did what God had preordained to have happen. In my particular view, there are absolutely some things that are hard working out of God's preordained purpose. God absolutely has a purpose, particularly in Messiah, because that was predicted back in Genesis chapter 3 at the latest. So yeah, God absolutely has some places where things are preordained. It's his plan working out. My thing is that's not true for everything. That's true for some things, absolutely, but that is true for everything. Did God preordain in the same way? I've worked with a situation a while back. It's kind of my example. A preteen, a lower elementary girl was raised in a Christian home where her Christian leader dad raped her mom noisily and violently, and the little girl saw and heard that whole thing and was deeply scarred by that. Was that God's preordained plan and purpose being worked out? I can't find anything in Scripture that says that, and it seems so contrary to the character and goodness of God. I reject that as God's preordained plan and purpose. God works good in those contexts, but that particular event, I don't think biblically and certainly not emotionally, that is not God's preordained. And I realize a lot of Christians say it is. I just disagree with them.
You can respond.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it's certainly not my point to say that sort of horrific act is preordained. I want to know about what's predictable. And to preordain something in the distant future, and then to have lots of unpredictable, literally unpredictable things that are born of human free will, between here and now seems to me an impossible story to tell, because every actor that was supposed to end up in the faraway event might have been killed by bad people that used their free will to kill people, and then it couldn't be the case that these people did this thing predicted in Genesis 3.
I will give you a prediction within the next 2.5 hours that I'll give my wife a hug and a kiss.
Right, but can you give me the time and day of it and things like that? I mean, the specifics.
Within the next 2.5 hours, that will happen.
But that's a very broad prediction.
Oh yeah, yeah, and I'm not God. You should have pointed it out too.
I mean, so, right, there are things we can know about each other. Insurance companies couldn't make any money if we couldn't predict very, very accurately how long you're going to live.
And see, I can predict my actions quite specifically, and that's what we do in the ordination of the Messiah.
I can predict almost everyone I know well's actions almost as well as I can predict mine. In fact, sometimes I'm more erratic. Right? I can predict with absolute certainty that you're not going to stab me in the throat in the next 10 minutes.
Can you? You're right.
So we, this is how we form friendships. We get to know people well enough. We know how they're going to react. We like them for other reasons. If they weren't very, very predictable, they'd be too erratic to be friends with. And therefore, I'm tempted to say we're ultimately mechanistic. It's just we're so complicated, we can't predict everything. The amazing thing is that we can predict so much of people with very complicated brains, differences in historical and educational background than us. We get it right all the time. Not all the time, but very, very often. When somebody creeps you out, you later find out there was probably a reason. We've got all of these ways of predicting human behavior, and that's amazing if we're not mostly mechanisms, or else completely mechanisms, the workings of which aren't yet fully known.
Next question, please.
Normally I would be very concise asking this, but as we have so few questions, I'll be a bit more verbose than I would normally be prepared to be.
We're going to run over time anyway. I know
Yeah.
what's going to happen.
In true Socratic Club fashion, this is directed primarily at Dr. Patton, but obviously I want responses from both of you. And I'll give a bit of context to my question. Obviously the two of you are presenting worldviews that are quite divergent from one another's. My own worldview tends to align very closely with yours, Dr. Breshears. And I guess the context that I'm coming from is, in my own mind, a sort of materialist, hedonist worldview makes a hell of a lot of sense. Dr. Patton, talked about how people take comfort in the idea of, I'm going to see mom and dad and my brother and grandma and grandpa, again when I die. For some reason, that's not really the natural inclination I have. I would be much more comfortable if, when I get hit by a bus, that's it. But I've done a lot of interesting things in my brief life. I've seen a lot of different things. I've studied a lot of faiths other than, sort of the mainstream Christian faith in such detail that if there was something there, I feel like I would have found it. And what I keep coming back to is that the only faith that I've ever found, the only worldview, the only philosophy that seems to fit with what I actually observe happening in the world, the only one that makes sense is sort of a mainstream Christian worldview that's based on, the Judeo-Christian belief system. And obviously, Dr. Breshears, you've come to a similar or equivalent conclusion, and Dr. Patton, you have come to something that's quite different. And I wonder if I know that I'm not presenting a very coherent question, but I wonder if you would both comment on that and kind of how you've come to the worldviews that you have both come to very independently of one another, and what reinforces that and kind of your, as you keep going along and that kind of thing.
Does that question make sense?
Maybe.
It sounds like an origin of how you came to have your beliefs. Is that right?
Basically, I made a meal of it to try and help.
If I don't answer your question, then you can re-clarify.
We have plenty of time.
I told Dr. Breshears that I never remember believing in God of any sort. My parents took me to church but I was usually doodling on the program. And I may be recreating my childhood, but I just don't, I know I went through no serious phases of belief, and he just wasn't there. And my dad was a deacon in the Presbyterian church, and I remember one time when I was forced to go through, they weren't called confirmation classes though, but whatever they were called, I was asking annoying questions, and I had a really wonderful, open-minded pastor that said, keep asking those questions, they're very hard, read these books. And I never got to that place where I believed in God or any supernatural order that was standing behind the universe. And then, I suppose, naturalistic science and my understanding of it, and then the way philosophy sort of explained to me the limits of inquiry of any sort, got me to a place that just, I feel that I'm kind of stuck in it. It would take, I wrote this paper once, I write annoying papers, where I'm talking about Hume's piece on miracles from the Inquiry. And he says, the reason not to believe that someone rose from the dead is because we've never seen it happen. There are old stories about it. And he says, but yes, isn't that interesting how the miracles don't happen anymore? All the miracles happened a long time ago. And there's other reasons people might have testified to the miracles. People could have been trying to draw their community tighter during a time of crisis. The same reason anyone will misrepresent something or accidentally misrepresent something. We know those things happen. We've never, seen a person resurrected, so Hume says you ought to believe that it didn't happen. There's another more plausible thing that we have seen going on, exaggeration and so on, that explains reports of miracles. And so I wrote this one paper that said, addressing this question, I was invited to come and give this paper, and I said, look, I suppose I can tell you exactly how it might come to be that I would start claiming that I believed in God. I could have a blinding on the road to Damascus. And then I said, but when I think about that, no matter how sincere I was, right now, Hume-loving Michael would say, well, let's see, did Michael really have a divine encounter on the road to Damascus, or did he snap? We've had people snap. We know people have mental illnesses. So what's more likely? Hume seems to cut very deeply without being dogmatic. And that's the question I was asked to answer. Why isn't Hume just being a dogmatist when he says it's never rational to believe in miracles? And what he says is there's always, up till now, been a better explanation, and it's hard to see how there could get the tables turned. I don't know. That's,
That's excellent food for thought, and I appreciate it.
Pardon?
That's excellent food for thought, and I appreciate it.
Well,
You've told part of your story, Dr. Breshears,
Yeah.
you need to add.
The existence of miracles, I mean, I'll just pick one point, Michael, where you said that we don't see miracles today. I've seen them. I've got a student currently who I actually asked him to bring his medical records of his leukemia-type blood cancer and the written prognosis by an oncologist of what would happen. And in that particular case, he and his group prayed for God's relief. And I can't prove the causality of the prayer, but what I can prove is that cancer is gone. And it's not one where you get spontaneous remission as a normal predictive kind of thing. It was extraordinary. And I would claim that there are miracles today. They're unusual today, and they're unusual in that day. And I'd argue that the resurrection from the dead in the case of Jesus is unique, though other resurrections have happened. I can't claim it from personal experience, but my friend John Mark Comer was in India. He, like me, is very skeptical about things, and he was talking to an Indian pastor there, and he said, I've heard of stories of people being resurrected from the dead, and it's always somebody I've never heard of. Pastor so-and-so, you live here in India, and you know a lot of people. Do you know somebody who actually knows somebody who's been resurrected from the dead? And the Indian pastor said, oh yes, my wife. She was dead for 3 days. We prayed. She came back to life. Hallelujah. What he didn't do is say, and if you give me $29.95, I will give you the prayer cloth that we used. Something like that. It was just a simple statement of fact. Now, there was no scientific stuff, but in the case of my student, I've got scientific papers to show that a miracle of some sort happened. I don't think miracles, I think Hume's thing fails in light of that present reality.
I don't want to sit here and argue particular cases or
But you have to in that case.
Okay, then this is the only type of this leukemia that's ever gone into spontaneous remission. Because it has to be more than unusual for you to not back the usual course of events.
Yeah.
And there are remission rates for every type of cancer.
Yeah, they it's spontaneous remission. Okay, what does spontaneous remission mean? What is the curative factor? And in your case, you have to say, well, I don't know, it just happened. And I think there's a reason for it. It's called God. But we're both hypothesizing the cause for an effect.
Can we go to the next question before? Sure, actually, maybe go to that.
Gentlemen, thank you for both being here tonight. I've got 2 quick questions, and I would like to hear both of you respond. First, I would ask, would you describe hope as a psychological phenomenon that is rooted in knowledge of the past and past performance, or is it rooted in a future promise and a belief in something that will happen in the future? And then the follow-up question to that is, how would you relate hope to surety? Thank you.
I will say my heritage is from Missouri, Ozarks of Missouri. That's not redneck country, but it's absolutely the Missouri cynicism. You know, we're the show me state. I am not an optimist. I absolutely am not an optimist. And being almost 67 years old, I'm losing what little optimism I had from my Missouri heritage. I am, however, a very hopeful person. And the source of my hope is that God is active and working in this world and empowering people to do good and just things. That is the source of my hope. It is not the source of my optimism. And the difference between hope and optimism to me is critical. So you come back to the question of surety. Why do I have hope for this world not nuking itself or diseasing itself or poisoning itself, or the Sochi Olympics going up in flame with the, I've been in that area. I've taught in Dagestan, there's a crowd there. And why do I believe that, how do I do with that? I do believe God's work, and the surety is the God's promise not to give up on this broken world and his commitment to bring good. That's the reason for my hope, and the reason there's a surety involved with that. Frankly, when I was an atheist, and that's the thing that was bringing me to the point of suicide, is I realized there is absolutely no hope, because I can't be an optimist. I've seen too much.
Curiously, from my point of view, I'm very pessimistic. You can ask anyone. I'm in a good mood most of the time, but I'm a terrible pessimist. I think hope is when hope occurs, as it does with gamblers, because of past experience, you know full well you're not going to hit the lottery, but you hope you will, so you make a stupid move and you throw the dice again. I'm not calling people with hope stupid. I'm saying, the way I look at it, when I hope for something, it's because some part of my experience tells me it's really unlikely that I'm going to pass this test, but I hope I do. I hope I guessed right. I hope I guessed enough. And in philosophy, that's all you have to do is guess. It's great. So hope is a psychological state that I think most often correlates to fearing that things are going to go like they have so far, and wishing that they wouldn't, because some feature of them has been unpleasant for you, like the losing streak of the gambler or the dread of failing the test. And for surety, I guess I go with probability all the way down and say that outside of axiomatic systems like math or tautologies, I'm not sure that anything is true.
So we have about 10 minutes left, and we have
2 questions here, 1 question.
3 more questions.
3 more questions.
Okay. So I'll ask for kind of quick, 30, 45-second responses.
Snappy answers.
Yeah. But question from this side, please.
This question is for both of you. You both discussed earlier about children with Down syndrome and how you both feel that it is bad, evil to do away with them. Now, from an evolutionary standpoint, you can make the case for that because they are humans and there can be that evolutionary feel towards them as you described earlier. But what about animal rights? if someone went and killed all of the penguins on Antarctica, that wouldn't affect us directly, and they're pretty distant evolutionary relatives of ours. So why would we feel like that is bad?
I wouldn't want to be around the person that killed all the penguins in Antarctica any more than I would want to find out that my children had been playing with Barbie and Ken's dream dungeon. Because people that think it's okay to indiscriminately slaughter animals lack a very important sort of empathy. Just like it would be, kids should think that dolls are alive and feeling. But if Barbie is drawing and quartering Ken, then something's really gone wrong in that person's mind. So what's wrong is we've got a dangerous person on the loose. And the more likely you are not to project empathetically to other living organisms, and in some cases non-living organisms, better keep your hands off my teddy bear, because I've had it since I was 3 and I still have it. That's what's wrong. It's not ontological evil.
Oh, gosh, you got me going, Michael. This is fun. My reason, of course, for not killing penguins is the divine command to care and keep. And that is a basic tenet of my morality, is my responsibility to God, others, self, and rest of creation. And if I were part of killing other penguins or not trying to stop others from doing it, I'd be violating the very command of God. And that's not so much a fear that I would get eternal punishment or something. I don't want to displease a God who loves me that much. That'd be my baseline from it. But the other piece is, and this is a psychological piece, is people who hurt animals, and this is my pastoral side of work, people who torture and hurt animals almost inevitably end up torturing and hurting themselves and often others. And it's a sign of something as a serious self-destructive psychological disorder.
Next question, please.
Yeah, you were talking earlier about specific medical miracles. I had a brain tumor, a very serious one, and I was told that maximum I would only live 15 years. Well, that was in 1984. I also had a giant blood clot the entire length of my right leg, and I was told I'd have to be on blood thinners the rest of my life. I trained and ran several marathons with my cane and my leg brace. I'm no longer on any kind of medication like that. I don't think this is a miracle because of God. I think it's a miracle because I busted my chops and got out of the wheelchair. And so I guess what I'm saying is, where's the line here? You know, how can you say this would be something that is a miracle from God versus the human effort to get somewhere?
Boy, that's a good question. As I said when I said that, I'm hesitant to proclaim a divine cause for this cancer going away. But in his case, what he specifically did was go to his group and they prayed fervently and coherently for divine remission. I'm guessing from your story you didn't do that.
No.
Okay, so that would make the divine cause in your case much less likely, but I'd still be, I am very hesitant to say God healed my student. But it's one of those kind of things.
I promise you I'm not trying to be flippant.
Go for it.
The student had extensive state-of-the-art medical treatment for quite a while, right?
Actually, you hadn't had the treatment yet.
None? Okay.
None. I mean, they've done very basic stuff. They were predicting what he would have to have done. And I've forgotten, it's a particular chemo for this particular kind of thing. It's not one of the nice chemos. And he had not begun the treatment yet when the cancer, I mean, he was well into it, but they were setting up this treatment regimen and he had not done any of the kind of normal cancer therapy yet, just supportive kind of stuff.
No, I mean, I accept cases of spontaneous remission, and we did.
And it could be spontaneous remission. I'm not going to claim
Right.
divine cause. It's just one of those, kind of things.
Yes, that's an uncaused remission, I'd say. Or an unknown cause of remission.
Yeah.
Perhaps
Unknown
divine,
cause.
perhaps divine, perhaps not.
Yeah. But the prayer piece was a piece of that. And again, I'm not going to argue what happened as well as, kind of things.
Okay, next question, please.
Thank you guys for coming, and I apologize for coming late. Just to clarify before I ask the questions, you said altruism originated with sympathy and empathy, right? Is that the...
It originated with the fact that creatures that took care of their dependent young stuck around, where any creatures that didn't wouldn't be around. So it was an advantage to sacrifice your own good for the good of another before there were any conscious beings on Earth. I don't think the birds consciously did it.
Okay, so maybe this is reaching, but I'm a bit of a sci-fi nut, and I was wondering, when people evolve to, they think saying get rid of emotion, get rid of sympathy and empathy, and that makes a more advantageous being. And so if it was more advantageous to not have those emotions, just to know that if I do this, then it makes my species go longer, then why did emotions or sympathy and empathy just come along at all?
Well, if these traits evolved in us, then they weren't chosen by us. We were given them because of our genetic heritage. In terms of the sci-fi angle that you mentioned, it's always kind of made me insane. Science fiction, especially Star Trek, is one of the most anti-rationality shows ever. Who's the crazy, bloodless, emotionless person? Spock. Who's always right? Kirk, that's ready to blow up the Enterprise because he doesn't want to pay the Klingons 1 cent in tribute. So the story is rationality is evil. All the super beings, what do? They capture human beings and torture them so they can remember what emotions are like. It's a very weird trend in sci-fi. But I don't think emotionlessness would be advantageous to the species at all. I think we would all be killed pretty quickly without our emotional cues that we pick up on from other people, when to run, when to glom together, when to defend each other, and so on. So I don't think that's a great answer, but trying to cut it short.
The only thing I'll say in relation to that is sci-fi is not worldview neutral.
Last question.
Hi. My question for both of you. And when you both talked about evil, and so I don't believe that evil comes from God, and I think people only can be evil. So, for example, if a flood comes in and I'm not sitting there and it didn't kill me, then this flood is not evil, and God is not evil. And if I'm there and it killed me, then did God kill me or the flood kill me? So, statistically speaking, people only kill and do bad things and rape and do anything that we agree on that is wrong. So, my question is, does evil come from other than people?
Does the question make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I'll answer for myself, but I think that we're in agreement on this. I think only people can do bad things. But I don't believe in the existence of evil independent of human action. And I don't think, you don't think God does the evil things. God offers the better advice, and people, by choosing the worse advice, but there's still, I won't answer.
The thing I would add at that spot is I think there are other personal beings beyond just humans. I do believe in the demonic realm. It's described in Scripture, and I've seen it. I also believe that there's evil in a little different sense, is what's called natural evil, and that's the broken world where things happen that are destructive. Mount St. Helens blowing up, for example, is not just merely a natural phenomenon of mountains blowing up. I think that's a destructive thing, and therefore comes in a different category of evil. So I do see evil as other than just personal actions, and I see personal actions as more than just human actions. I see animal evil as well. It's described in Scripture. A bull that gores is to be treated. We see today, we take pit bulls that kill other dogs, and we euthanize them if need be. So yeah, there's evil beyond human evil, I would say.
But would you say that the evil, other than the natural evil here in the earthly realm, comes from humans choosing to take the advice of these other personalities, these other consciousnesses? I mean, I think you said that Adam and Eve got offered two sets of options. They chose the wrong one, so that's what led to their doing bad things. Yeah. So there are the evil forces out there, but humans don't do anything bad until they make a choice to go that way. So there's no intrinsically evil person.
There's no intrinsically evil person. I would say all persons are created on the good side and choose evil, and then that evil is transmitted down both naturally and nurturally. nurture early.
Works for me.
Yeah.
All right, let's thank our speakers, everyone. So we have about 10 minutes, so let's do about a 3 to 5 minute closing statement from each speaker, and then I'll wrap it up, starting with, who's starting? Dr. Patton.
I forgot I was supposed to do this.
Would you like the podium, or do you want to sit?
I'll stay here. It takes me about 10 minutes to get up. Not really. I guess what happened here is exactly the sort of thing I wanted to have happen here. I hope, even though we differ so widely in worldviews and explanations for the things we witness, there's huge swaths of agreement, and that this gives you an opportunity, as it's given me, to think about why would anyone believe something other than what I believe? Well, why doesn't everyone agree with me? They must be foolish. But no, it's given me a really good chance to talk to someone, however briefly, that it couldn't be further away from the base cause of the world's realities than I am. And I think that's really interesting, and when people stop doing that, I think we get the sorts of churchgoers, I won't call them Christians, that do things that I think you think are as bad as I think they are. People become dogmatic, and I certainly perhaps have gone too far towards skepticism, because I believe that that's the only real defense against dogmatism. Hold out that everything you think, or any particular thing you think, might be false. But other people go too far in the other direction and become dogmatists and cause a lot of trouble in the world. The First World War, the Second World War, most of the wars are caused by people who never stop to think, wait a minute, is there another explanation for this, or is there another option? And I guess one joke that I told to a class once during a discussion like this, I said, I bet the number of people that have ridden into battle with a flag that said God might be on our side is very much lower than the number of people that have ridden into battle with the flag that said God is on our side. But I'm not tarring you with that brush, because I don't think you think there are reasons to ride into battle very often. So anyway, that's what I say. I appreciate the questions, the kind attention, and the opportunity to be here. This is great. Thanks.
That's good. The kind of question you set out at the beginning, I think, is a profound question, which is, what is the nature of justified belief? And I think that's, you lined out an excellent question there, and one that I think is, that we just really have to really think about. We have all kinds of beliefs, but what is the nature of justified belief? You know, do I wait before I do something until I have 100% certainty? Then you do almost nothing, and I think we agree on that. But I do believe there's justified belief, and that's why I'm not a skeptic, but I am somebody that believes you need to validate and verify belief systems. And because I do believe that God will work in this world, that's the major reason that I'm not a skeptic. Because I do believe God is at work doing good, and He's calling people into power, into work with Himself, and He's empowering them by His Holy Spirit. And that's why I'm a genuinely hopeful person in the place with a whole lot of evil stuff going on. And my justification of that belief always goes back to the Jesus narrative, not to a God who's out there somewhere that I can't have contact with. I'm looking to a story of Jesus who is a historical person, as verifiable, at least as verifiable, as the Buddha or Muhammad or Julius Caesar or any other major historical figure who didn't do their own writing. And Jesus did not do his own writing, but he left a legacy behind, and we can be quite certain of his teachings and his claims, unless you're this total cynical person. But mainstream Jesus scholars don't fundamentally disagree on his claims. And those claims, I think, are something we can look at. And on a question of what justifies belief, is what Jesus said. Did he really say it? And is what he claimed true? And I think based on historical evidence, I can have justified belief that Jesus is indeed a person who died and rose from the dead again. And that unique event in history gives me reason to take his claims very seriously. But beyond that, That would be kind of an evidential thing. The thing that really makes me committed to hopefulness based on the reality of the Jesus story is that story itself is such a gripping and compelling and world-changing narrative. And again, I will go to the George C. Marshalls of the world. We talk about the evil in World War I, and we know the evil post-World War I. I just in the World War I Museum in Kansas City, Missouri with my son and some others, and I saw the evils of that war. And the post-World War I evils were worse than the war itself in a lot of ways, because the victors did the normal thing. They extracted reparations from their defeated enemy. George C. Marshall, the Marshall Plan, Secretary of State, General of the Army in World War II, a deeply Christian man, said, let's do it the Christian way. And because of his deep commitment to Jesus Christ and his leadership abilities, was able to enact the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Germany, we rebuilt Japan, and the world was changed because of the hopefulness and the reality of the story of Jesus Christ being worked in the context of horrible evil. World War II was an unspeakable horror. Both my father and my father-in-law were parts of that war. And that's the reason it gives me hope in the world. And that's the question I want to leave you with tonight. It was kind of the agenda of our thing is where do we find reason for hope in a world where evil is very real? And to me, that's one of the questions that led me to the point of despair and suicide as an atheist. And I think I'm only to be grateful that Kathy Thompson was the one who invited me to look again firsthand at the Jesus story. And I'd ask you to do the same thing. Check for justified belief. Why is there hope in an evil world? I think there is reason, and his story comes back to the historical figure of Jesus and what he taught, and the people like George C. Marshall and Nelson Mandela and others like that who have followed that out. And I think it's worth checking out firsthand.
All right, let's thank both of our speakers. All right, and thank you everybody for coming to the debate tonight. The speakers as well as members.